the author of Breaking Ground, Anne Snyder, who will moderate the event, and she'll introduce the other speakers on her panel. Let's welcome Anne Snyder, Susannah Black, Luke Bretherton, and Emba.
Thank you. There are some things in life, and they may be the most important things, that we cannot know by research or reflection, but only by committing ourselves. We must dare in order to know. So said one J.H. Oldham in the early 1940s, a man whose clear foresight and hospitable grace nurtured the intellectual soil of a friendship hub across the pond, whose fragrance and urgent sense of purpose we here in this session are seeking to revive and grow once more. Oldham was an Englishman who convened a network of thinkers and civic leaders throughout the 1930s and 1940s to search out what he called the ways of God with man in years of a gathering storm and felt crisis. The people he convened shared certain characteristics. They were thinkers, but also doers. They were predominantly Christian, but not exclusively so. They had a variety of commitments, ecclesiastical and political, but no one party line. Their associations were informal, out of a group of some 40 people in different walks of life. Any one of them would be in contact with a number of others, some with many. The Moot, as this group came to be called, gathered regularly in London, often through great hardship and logistical complexity, from 1937 to 1949 to consider how to rebuild a better society after the war. They would interrogate questions like how best to relate faith to society, how to understand Christianity's role in this time of war and eventual social reconstruction, the crisis of modernity as a disintegrating force, the dynamics introduced by deepening secularization, by nationalisms and dignity-defying totalisms wrapped up toxically with race and strong men. And what was the point and purpose of human life in all of this? More specifically, the role of education, particularly higher education, in developing a capacity to think seriously about the timeless questions that mark our humanity. Oldham would spot what he deemed to be the most urgent problems for human society, which Christians ought to be confronting. And then he would move into action to bring together the wise and experienced in a deep, probing exercise of discussion, which might lead towards solutions. There were no quick fixes. In his experience, the lives of men and women in society just formed too delicate a web of relationships to be roughly reordered. But there was always a vision at the end of convening. As one biographer put it, Oldham was a prophet, looking out on the world with a keen eye for the acceptable moment at which a blow could be struck against oppression and for justice. The Moot was at once a vibrant intellectual center, as it also became a kind of publishing house, producing a newspaper that went out to tens of thousands throughout the war, a moral and interpretive companion to beleaguered citizens in fearful, disorienting times. Oldham described the stakes of the Moot, its publication, and the fruits of its conversations in the lives and public thinking of its participants in this way. Quote, "Unless such questions about human purposes and the circumstances of human flourishing are constantly raised, society will lose any sense of the transcendent and will become criterionless and prey to either managerial control or, more sinisterly, the blandishments of ideologies which claim to have the answer to human purposes in terms that liberal societies are in danger of not addressing." Perhaps this sounds a little apt once more. We are trying to revive something akin to the Moot, albeit in a different day, facing different challenges, in need of a much wider constellation of guides and unlikely relationships, institutional heft, and a sophisticated theory of social change. Susannah and I created Breaking Ground in the spring of 2020 in a desperate personal need for a space where people from many walks of life might tease out the depths of what was being revealed in our society and in the state of our own hearts. To see, maybe, if the riches of the Christian tradition might not shed light on where to from here, or at the very least, help inform the arc of the questions we all really needed to be asking. Susannah joined me, along with 20 other organizations ranging from wonderful magazines like Plough Quarterly, which you'll find downstairs, and my own Comment magazine, to seminaries, to think tanks, to networks of organizations playing a healing role on fractured ground, to cultural conveners like the Trinity Forum and this wonderful New York Encounter. We are an ecumenical group, a cognitively and culturally diverse group, and politically capacious, though not politically captive group. But all of us, and those we attracted to contribute to the platform from 2020 to 2021, were ultimately focused on three questions. One, what exactly is being revealed in this current crisis about society, about the state of our own hearts? Two, how have plagues historically provided opportunities for new beginnings, new building or renewal of institutions? And three, what institutions and cultural norms most acutely need renewing now, and how might that happen? What could be born anew in this pandemic time, and how might the people of God help in the building? So breaking ground took off. Our contributors pulled no punches on questions of unity and the polis, the relationship between justice and peace, the revived role of the home and education as we were all found ourselves in our households and forming children, of gift logics and neighborly ecologies. Launching publicly on June 4th, 2020, just hours after the first memorial service was held for George Floyd, the project, of course, soon had to stretch to engage even more painful realities of injustice than we had foreseen in the mere context of COVID-19. How do our institutions preserve their ideals while pruning their more habituated hypocrisies? Where are wise and courageous leaders we can look to for guidance and cooperate with and trust? Is it even possible to have an honest reckoning with our sins as nations and come out better and closer on the other side? Where are the bridge builders and the peacemakers and the placemakers and the justice builders working in appreciative tandem? The book that we're celebrating here memorializes the quest to answer these with integrity, personalism, scholastic excellence, and chronological humility. It is a morally probing record of historic time, an anthology of signature voices from many different sectors: politics, policing, education and journalism, medicine, business, theology and science, philanthropy and technology, and the family and the household too. But Breaking Ground is not just a book, but rather the substantive weaving together of a multifaceted community of writers, readers, institutions, and individuals who are committed to the kinds of patient discernment and open debate that a healthy reimagining of our pluralist commons will require. For not unlike Oldham's day in the 1930s and 40s, we too live in times of unmasking and unmaking. We might look back one day on these 2020s as a time between times, an uneasy liminality that projects an enormous gravity of choice on our leaders and on each one of us as citizens. Will we choose to find ourselves by protecting and projecting ourselves? Will we react in a constant seesaw between binaries of imagination that destroy anything having to do with grace or freedom or solidarity or agency? How do we preserve our humanity while being vacuumed up and into this relentless technological revolution? What is truth when shared conceptions of reality disappear? There is currently no network that is made up of institutional leaders missionally committed to forming the kinds of human beings who are as wise as serpents, yet gentle as doves in our complex pluralist age. There are many groups that have gathered in recent years to try to diagnose all that is plaguing Christianity's witness in the West. And in my opinion or observation, they tend to be populated by celebrity platformed individuals who often begin their diagnostic exploration by looking first at just the political symptoms and identitarian lines of us versus them. These groups have their purpose, and they may in time prove to be effective in shifting the current state of affairs, but Breaking Ground is making a different kind of bet. Not unlike New York Encounter, one of our treasured partners, we want to look outward first. One that seeks to be constructive for society writ large, from the riches of a tradition that we believe still casts unrivaled light on the nature of the human person and the laws that govern civic peace. As such, Breaking Ground is quite intentionally a constellation of civil society institutions informed by key thought leaders and local community shepherds all over North America, who are devoted to ways and means questions of formation, institutional health, and concrete strategies to redeem all that has gone sour in our broader public square. The bulk of large-scale moral reflection today seems to be sourced by two poles. On the one side is a defensive tribalism that seeks to protect their rights to follow their beliefs, projecting a fearfulness that genuine care for a pluralist commons will only lead to a weakening of one's way of life and to destruction of some romanticized heritage. On the other is an identity politics that privileges the victim and seeks to overturn established power. Both of these have misguided understandings of the infinite dignity of persons, all persons, and increasingly look more like evil twins than opponents. Breaking Ground just wants to try to fan the flames for a different public sphere altogether. We are an ecosystem of institutions and individuals bound together by a felt call to recover, build, and embody a Christian humanism that cares for the full flowering of human agency through forms of just and generous common life. This kind of life works itself out through thick webs of formative institutions that, in turn, enable purposeful dialogue and relationship between friends and strangers. It is a Christian humanism of encounter and exchange, and it's one that we really need to reawaken, nurture, and grow. Finally, as we look ahead, and I'm just kind of giving you a forecast before we go to our actual conversation, as Breaking Ground looks ahead to our next chapter of both private meeting and public work, we want to make a bet that a key task of this era, this rapidly changing era, is to learn how to synchronize top-down, often national capacities and conceptual frameworks with bottom-up, localized agency. Theories of change that assume that ideas just translate automatically from elite corridors into praxis are just probably not paying that much attention to how much moral authority has been lost by elites in the eyes of the broader public, nor to how the actual mechanisms of transfer and translation have broken down in an era where information of all kinds is so widely accessible. At the same time, some of the most promising and creative solutions being charted at largely local levels are not being tracked for a more macro understanding of trends and patterns that could map a larger constructive movement, nor are these local, often hidden heroes granted the kinds of conceptual frameworks that could help them make sense of their work and vocations within a larger story. The next phase of Breaking Ground is going to be building a two-way street of learning and accountability between local doers and national intellectual and coalition leaders in order to bridge this chasm and discover the proper vehicles of translation between ideas and action. We're going to be hosting events in a variety of cities that will introduce national thinkers and writers and scholars to local doers. Each forum will explore a theme that integrates a pressing question for that city or region, with recent themes that broader conversations ongoing being had by Breaking Ground's national network of institutions, as well as questions being asked by all of the partners that are part of this network, including New York Encounter, in their own content delivery spheres. We're going to try to create an infrastructure for smaller group discussions and local collaborations in these regions, tapping into existing ecosystems that have established pathways of intentional cross-sector learning and a shared love of their place. We hope untold fruits come out of this sort of mosaic, but I'll just mention a few of my own hopes. wouldn't it be neat to see a revival, perhaps, of a Christian Democratic Party in the US? Wouldn't it be amazing in our lifetime to discern a renewed moral enchantment of a much-needed civil rights movement 2.0, 3.0, able to hold the necessary critique and the grace-drenched construction in tension and in truth together? Wouldn't it be refreshing to see people of faith loving in public, and to see a community of faith so agile in the face of suffering and chaos that it might actually compel needed allies instead of repelling our own? Wouldn't it be galvanizing to see words not impoverished of meaning or trustworthiness, but chiseled by incarnate realities on the ground, their midwives informing our public conceptualizers? Breaking Ground wants to revive a field of Christian humanism toward these ends, integrating thought and action with all the encounter and hospitality and wholeness that the tradition demands. And helping us embody the seeds for this reflowering today are three wonderful people, very special people. Christine Emba, here in the middle, is a columnist for the Washington Post writing about ideas in society. She is the author of the upcoming book, I believe coming out next month, titled Rethinking Sex, a Provocation, published by Penguin Sentinel. And I must also selfishly say she is a sharper than sharp contributing editor to Comment magazine, which I steward, and just a model of intellectual courage with a touch of sass and a lot of eloquence. Luke Bretherton right here is the Robert E. Cushman Distinguished Professor of Moral and Political Theology and Senior Fellow of the Keenan Institute for Ethics at Duke University, as well as a visiting professor at St. Mellitus College in London. Before joining Duke in 2012, he taught at King's College in London, and his latest book, which I highly, highly recommend, is called Christ and the Common Life, Political Theology and the Case for Democracy, with other books including Resurrecting Democracy, Christianity and Contemporary Politics, and Hospitality as Holiness, which develops a constructive response to pluralism. Alongside his scholarly work, he is actively involved in forms of grassroots democratic politics, both in the UK and in the US. Finally, last but most certainly not least, moderating this conversation with me will be my editorial comrade in arms, Susannah Black, whose energy, chutzpah, and just gregarious editorial verve helped make Breaking Ground the discerning and even fascinating cultural product we've been told that it might be. Susannah is a senior editor at Plough and involved in pretty much every magazine you can think of, including Mere Orthodoxy, The Front Porch Republic, Advantes, Subdavenant, and many more. A native New Yorker, she is going to welcome you to her hometown and the urge that is the theme of this festival, this urge for the truth.
Thank you, Anne. Is this on? Yeah, that sounds right. So we are not going to be going up there just because this is more of a conversation. But I'm so pleased to see you all. This is quite surreal. So much of what we did when we were doing this project was from our, COVID isolated, boroughs in DC and Queens, and coming together in person, seeing a lot of your unmasked faces, which feels great and risky, is just a thrill. And the fact that we were able to do this thing and pull together so many amazing partners and voices in this really strange 2 years has been an incredible privilege. When we started thinking about doing this, what I think thought we were going to be doing was, or at least I had this fantasy that it was going to be like, now, finally, there was a common enemy. There was this common thing that we were all going to fight. We're all human beings. We all are embodied. We are going to find out that we're embodied and that we actually are vulnerable, that we can't, will ourselves into safety. We actually need to, make accommodation for the reality of human weakness and human frailty, and that's going to bring left and right together, and it's going to end the culture war. And it's going to just put everything else into perspective, because this is obviously a virus, which is a common enemy of humanity, and just as though like it's sort of like an alien invasion, except we don't even have to kill aliens, we can just kill this virus, and it'll be great. That's what I was thinking about in, I guess, April of 2020. And then some other stuff happened. And it became clear that far from that being the case, the isolation that we were now kind of experiencing and the kind of emotional unraveling that I think a lot of people went through, especially early in COVID, but certainly ongoing, led to an increased polarization, and the fact that people were now experiencing more and more reality through their smart devices and through screens started to make it feel as though the two worlds that the two Americas lived in were diverging from each other at an ever more rapid pace. And so our job started to feel much more like attempting to discern reality between those two poles, and essentially by refusing those two poles, refusing to choose one reality or the other of these two that we were told you have to buy into one or the other of these narratives, and that's just going to be the way that you're going to conduct yourself through these difficult 2 years. I couldn't do that because I didn't think that either of those two narratives were either coherent in themselves or complete, at all. I think that there is a reality that we are accountable for, and that searching for that reality together in public and with love is something that is our marching orders. Like, that's what we're supposed to be doing here, and then responding to that reality well. And an attempt to do that can lead to difficulties because you're seen as not taking a side. And I don't think that not taking a side is always the right thing to do, but I certainly felt in this case, as we were trying to navigate through this extremely politicized and strange world, publishing people who, often were simultaneously publishing, getting published in the American Conservative magazine, or in The Nation, or, in the New York Times, or in, probably not, I don't know, the Daily Wire, but we were publishing people from across the political spectrum, and they were getting really strange responses from their constituencies often, and that kind of made me think that we were probably doing something right. Again, reality is something that is outside us. We don't invent it. We don't get to decide what it is. That's true of moral reality as well. And what we were attempting to do was to discern complex truths in public. There was a quote from Oliver O'Donovan, who's probably my favorite living political theologian, who actually has a piece that appeared in the book, which was an incredibly exciting thing for me. He talks about political obligation, and he says that the subject, the citizen, has a more basic obligation, the obligation of a member of society, something owed to the neighbor before anything is owed to the ruler. This is the duty to preserve the public truth of social engagement by exercising candor in the public realm. Yet free speech can only be encouraged, not conferred, for free speech is participation in the Word of God, not a privilege which one form of constitution may confer, another refuse. Nor is it a right that one citizen may claim, another forego. That would imply that only the private citizen who exercised it has an interest in it, whereas candor is of the greatest importance for the public realm itself. Candor is a simple public duty, often unperformed, often performed badly, out of simple reluctance to take responsibility for the truth on which the community depends. Behind many a story of tyranny lies a collusion between oppressor and oppressed, a community that prefers to accept a shrunken public realm rather than pay the price of discerning and articulating complex truths in public. That's what we were trying to do. We were trying to discern and articulate complex truths in public. The book is a record of our attempts to do that and our colleagues' attempts to do that through 2020. We are continuing to attempt to do that through the ongoing work of Breaking Ground. And these two people who are up on stage with me now, are in their own ways people who are practitioners of that. Luke is, I think, going to give us a little bit of a history of one aspect of the way that Anne and I have described this work to ourselves, the aspect that is called Christian humanism. What that is and how that fits into the project that Breaking Ground has been, he'll probably be able to give us a couple of ideas about.
Well, a huge joy to be with you. I find myself somewhat discombobulated coming from North Carolina, where mask mandates are very much in force, in a southern state to a northern state where there seems to be everyone's free and easy. These things, so I'm suffering some cognitive dissonance, but an absolute joy to be with you. So I want to pick up on this theme Anne and Susannah mentioned about Christian humanism, and it's one of the things that came through in the text and then subsequent conversation, and it set my brain racing, and there's kind of, what do we make of this term? And it was certainly central to a moment which I think has strong historical parallels to our contemporary moment of polarization and the kind of paranoid politics of both left and right, as the moment of the 20s and 30s that J.H. Oldham and others were trying to think through, a moment which gave birth to things like Christian democratic parties and a whole wave of cultural engagement. And in thinking about this, it struck me that a kind of key text historically, and you'll forgive me for a little bit of scriptural reference, as a theologian, never trust a theologian who doesn't talk about scripture, there's lots of them out there. But a key text is this moment in John's Gospel when Pilate presents Jesus to the crowd, and in the Vulgate translation, it's often taken up in art and in literature as eke homo, here is the human, or here is, in the Greek it's anthropos, here is the human. And the Christian traditions heard Pilate, in many ways, preaching against himself. It's presenting Christ as the true measure and form of the human. And of course, that's been taken up, and we tend to, obviously in theology, think about Christ as fully divine, but there's this other dimension which doesn't tend to get as much attention, which is Christ as fully human. And in this moment, we have this picture of the true human. Now, of course, in the very next gesture, Pilate gives over Christ as one who's standing there as the true human, as one who is bound, beaten, and betrayed, to be then handed over for crucifixion, and to be abandoned by all. And so there's this sense that you have both the measure and form of the human in Christ, and, as per Matthew 25, where do we really encounter Christ? It's at scenes of violation, it's at scenes of abandonment, it's with the afflicted, the sick, the lepers in the patristic day, the prisoners in all days, those who are oppressed and dominated. And we can hear echoes of this in someone like Gregory of Nyssa's famous fourth sermon or homily on the book of Ecclesiastes, where he condemns slavery completely and calls out for the church to identify and look after lepers. And in the scenes where the early church stays in the city at the time of plague, because this is where Christ, almost sacramentally, is present. If you want to encounter Christ, you can only encounter Christ and thereby discover your own humanity and what it really means to be human at these scenes of violence, at these scenes of violation, at these scenes of abandonment. And this double aspect, Christ as the true human, we discover our humanity at those, when we're caring for the sick, when we're looking after prisoners, when we're visiting prisoners, when we're forming a common life and trying to address the needs of those who are oppressed or those who are afflicted. This is taken up in the tradition in many, many different ways. And we can think of Christian humanism emerging in many ways as a kind of endless response, this dynamic. And you have it both as a theological project, how do we make sense of Christ as the true human, and what does it mean to understand ourselves as human in the light of that? It's an educational, formational project, a kind of virtue project, and here the tradition takes up notions of paideia in ancient Greece and humanitas in the classical Roman world, and feeds into the liberal arts curriculum of the medieval university and very much shapes that sense of the university as a place of formation and the virtues. We have echoes of it in the American liberal arts tradition, in the kind of great books program. But there's a sense in which you have to be formed to become a human in the image of Christ and participate in that. But crucially also, it's a political and economic project. Where is the human taken as the measure of that as in Christ? Where is that violated? Where is that oppressed? Where are people not able to exercise their agency, able to come and fully realize themselves as persons in relationship with others? And that gives a whole raft of political and economic projects. And we can think of the 20th century of, I think particularly here in the Catholic tradition, of something like rerum novarum, and in response to industrialization and the kind of deracination of social and human life by terrible working conditions, and the way the church got behind unions, and how are we going to enable people to come together to realize their humanity in work and to realize what humane forms of work are going to be. And so that's just one project that feeds off and riffs off this kind of line. But it's also an artistic project as well, and we can think of, for example, many of the depictions of through the tradition of that very scene, Ecce Homo, not millions, but many wonderful works of art. But we can think of music of Bach and others. How do we render the human in the image of Christ through art, through literature, through poetry, and can look at a whole raft of work. And again, there were many artists involved in the moot that Anne spoke to. And so this sense of a theological project, a kind of formation in the virtues, an educational project, and the kind of work that needs to go on to cultivate us in humanity in the image of Christ. And then a political and economic project that centres the place of the human and all that threatens it, and particularly in the modern period, how that's threatened by either state totalitarian projects or the dominance of the market, which wants to render everything and everyone into a commodity. In our own day, we can think about the turning of friendship itself in Facebook land into a commodity to be bought and sold. So the defence of the human and the creation of the institutions which cultivate a more humane way of being together and the forms of common life that make that possible. And then lastly, an aesthetic project of how do we render, in many ways, give witness to the beauty of the human in Christ and its possibilities aesthetically and imaginatively to revive our own sense of what it means to be human through the arts. And so I think this is really, I think, an exciting moment to try and recover something of a kind of Christian civic, and I would add creation-attuned vision of Christian humanism. And focusing out from that, I think if the kind of move beyond a highly ideologicalized, polarized political discourse, we're in this moment when the human is both never been, some account of a shared humanity has never been more needed, and the account of who counts as the human and whose dignity is respected and who's included in the human community, but also when we're at this moment when the dissolution of the human, whether it's questions of editing genes and a kind of divided humanity at that level, or the sense of there can be no shared or common life between us, there's only histories of violence and violation. And I think this sense of what does it mean, particularly for people of faith, to recover some richer notion of the human. And I think there are wonderful resources there over many millennia of this Christian humanist tradition that might help us begin a different kind of and quality of conversation.
I think I tried to draw this back a bit to, Breaking Ground, this book and this project that we're all a part of. One of the things that I found both enlivening and somewhat terrifying about the last 2 years is that the crisis that we've been in, a crisis on multiple levels, whether it's pandemic, whether it's sort of racial divides and non-reconciliation, whether it's an economic crisis that may well still be unfolding, is that it has alerted us to our humanity and our shared humanity, even as we are divided by our different polarizations and partisan moves. I think as we, foundered our way through this pandemic, people did notice the things that they were missing, the things that they actually had in common that they had not realized before. I think the pandemic almost tenderized us in many ways, made us aware of our loneliness, a lack of connection to others, the fact that community, which we had taken for granted, had somehow crumbled even further without our noticing it, and when we needed it, was no longer there. And I think that that is one of the things that has animated my writing over the past 2 years, and I think has animated all of us, now that there is this sort of openness, this realization that things are missing in people's lives, things which we all share as humans. There's an opportunity to hand people something, to try and give suggestions for where one might look. And of course, reaching people of different backgrounds and different orientations takes a certain sensitivity and tenderness to their premises, their interests. You can speak to a Christian about Christian topics, make references to John and Christian theologians and philosophers, and perhaps expect that to be understood because of the shared context. But then writing in a national newspaper, who knows who might be reading you? It could be someone with no background in that at all. And I think that what I try to do, and have tried to do even more in this moment, is focus on those areas where we can all feel that something is missing or something has gone wrong, even if we can't necessarily put a name on it, even if we don't conceive of what has gone wrong or what is missing in the same way. So, for instance, we have the question, a pandemic of loneliness. That was something that was taking place. And obviously, as Christians, we had answers to that. We had thoughts on what this could be. How would you translate that to someone else in a way that invites them in, that meets them where they are? My current work, or one of the things that I'm working on now, is, as Anne mentioned, a book about sex, relationships and dating in the sort of modern era. And this is an area where I think almost everyone in both the secular and religious worlds has felt somehow that there's something off in the way that we relate to each other, that throughout all of the revolutions, sexual, libertarian and otherwise, it's still not working the way that we feel that it should. Love is still not available for us in the way that we as humans feel that it should be. How do we talk about that with each other, whatever our backgrounds? I think the breaking ground that the pandemic has done actually has given us more opportunity, not less, to reach out to people who are not like ourselves, because we all share this feeling and this experience, and it's visceral right now, where in the past it might not have been. And so in my work, I think that I would say that I do less, perhaps, explicitly Christian evangelism in some ways, and more trying to awaken people, or at least help them to acknowledge the realizations that they have as humans, as members of our shared human family. There are things that we hope for, that we long for, that we need. We want community, we want love, we want beauty, we want goodness and truth. We all feel that. Where do we go? What does real goodness look like? What is real beauty? Where can real truth be found? How do we relate to each other well? And everyone is longing for that in some way in this moment. And the best thing that you can do is put your hand in theirs and accompany them to finding it from whatever starting point they're at.
Christine, you just beautifully answered the question I was going to ask you both, and I'm going to ask it anyways, because maybe we could flesh out a little more. What is it about, I was struck, Luke, a little bit in your historical telling of Christian humanism, And then you, Christine, I think beautifully airing this speaking of divided reality, I think a shared reality is exactly what you just said, that in this weird time of dehumanization, partly just because of our stripping away of bodies the last couple of years and embodied relating, we have awakened, we have attended to that, we've been more observant of that, which is most a part of our humanity. What is it about crisis? I mean, Luke, you talked about in the scriptural setting of these places of violence and violation and these cracks. What is it about felt crisis, particularly at a societal level, that has birthed again and again, perhaps at least a hopeful movement of Christian humanists and sort of humanist questions at their best being raised again to the consciousness of the everyday man and woman? Either of you, but yeah.
Well, I'd love to hear Christine's reflections on that. I mean, I think it's always difficult because the horror and the hope always come sutured together. So the mood you talked about, they're responding to a defense of the human as a moral creature and the name that there is good and evil in the world, and the refusal to reduce everything to ideology and to then force everyone to line up behind whatever ideology it is, that is pressed by the very horror they're seeing happening. And then that forces a sense of kind of almost the trivia gets burned off, and we have to really attend to the human and the fragility, but also the beauty of the human in the face of this horror. Or I think if we think about, whether it's the birth of the hospital in the 4th, 5th century, I think of someone like Dame Cicely Saunders in the post-war period, founding the hospice movement and looking at what's happening in medicine and its increasing technologization and thinking, what is a human way of dying? And that's central to her own vision in the foundation of the hospice movement and then subsequently palliative care. There's always a sense in which there's this act of almost desecration of the human that gives birth to a desire both to recover the sense of the sacredness of the human and also a recognition of the fragility. We can't assume the human is just a given. It's not just a kind of biological fact. It's a moral and political project that has to be struggled for through forms of shared struggle. And there's always forces which want to undermine the possibility and refuse the reality of that shared humanity. But we often assume, and I think the modern period has often made this false assumption that it's just obvious, self-evident. But and I think that's where the Christian humanist insight, that if you, that in that scene from John's Gospel, in the presentation of here is the human, and in that very presentation, here is one who is utter fragility, whose violation is there marked on his flesh, and who's about to be given over to death, that these things always come together. And I think that's what that text, we struggle to digest that, but I think that is what that text forces us to confront and that's why it's been taken up so many times in Christian art and Christian literature.
One of the things that I've been doing a bit too much during this pandemic, and perhaps some can relate, is being on Twitter. And I was actually on Twitter this morning on the train on the way to this event, and Luke, I saw your tweets about the piety of profanity. And I thought they were just remarkable and that they made so much sense to me, and the idea was similar to what you were saying, that you can only profane something if you realize that it is meaningful, that it is sacred. They are tied together. And I think one of the things that both you and Anne spoke to earlier in our conversation is the fact that in the modern era, over the past several decades, it felt as though society, as though individuals had moved further away from their humanness. from their embodied nature, from the feeling that they were people in form, living in a world, a real place that had both the beautiful and the dark. And one thing about this pandemic, well, past 2 pandemic years, is that we have become much closer to those realities of life. Death has come to the forefront of our minds instead of receding into the back. Questions of family and place have become far more important. Living on Facebook or on Twitter and social media has become a very poor substitute once the real world and our ability to encounter each other in person was actively taken away from us. And I think, again, that gives us a moment. That sort of almost resacralizing of our lives and our space, our religion, our faith, our togetherness, by it being taken away, profaned by a pandemic, has awakened people to the chance to do something new, and that's something that we should try and grasp.
I think that's really well said. I think one of the ways that I've thought about this in particular is like, if we hadn't just gone through 2 years of getting really sick of Zooming, maybe we would be less cynical about the idea of like the metaverse. You know, like it's one of these things where like Zuckerberg comes in and is like, I have a great idea. Let's remove ourselves yet more from being physically embodied and together, because that will make life even better. And I think we've globally experienced like 2 years worth of, no, that's not true. And one thing that the Christian humanist, there are 2 things that the Christian humanist tradition, I think, kind of is very good at. And one of them is talking about what it means to actually thrive as a real human being with this real human nature that we definitely all share and definitely all have, even if we sometimes forget that or think that we are divided from each other or think that we can just decide what human nature is. No, Christian humanism is very good at kind of like, this is kind of the Aristotelian angle of Christian humanism, but also obviously the understanding of ourselves as being made in God's image, being made in Christ's image. It's good at helping us to know what it means to thrive as human beings. And then it's also really good at teaching us what it means when we're not thriving. Because obviously what happens after that scene with Pilate, after he says, behold the man, is that Jesus is given over to death, and then he's resurrected. And the sort of Christian humanist vision that stops with kind of just this vague Aristotelianism or this sort of pursuit of human excellence, I think can't actually, which Christian humanism has occasionally done, and this is one reason that Christians are occasionally suspicious of Christian humanism. It starts to just seem like generalized humanism. But Christian humanism at its best is a humanism in light of death and in light of resurrection. And, you know, that's something that either it's true or it's not. And if it's true, then everything is different. And everything about our everyday lives and everyday deaths and everyday pandemics is caught up in a much stranger and more hopeful story than I think we could have imagined.
I mean, I think that's just to pick up on I mean, I think that's exactly right. The sense then, and I think one of the moves thinking about it in our contemporary political moment, the recognition of mortality, which the pandemic pressed, the recognition that I do need a hug. You know, I can't get that through Zoom. You know, that I need to have a cup of tea with my mum now and again, and like that's just hanging out in that. There's something deeply to be cherished in these seemingly mundane, kind of trivial, but what we discover in a pandemic moment when we're locked in Zoom is there's something rather beautiful and profound in this very mundane, quotidian life together. And when we lose that, we realise there's a certain magic there, a kind of quality of enchantment almost, that we ignore just because it is every day, or don't become attuned to. And then when we recover it, when I finally have the hug from my mum and a cup of tea, I'm I'm like, this feels wonderful, and I would never admit that to her. But it's, so I think we recover something of the sacredness of that mundanity, and I think that the sense in which the beauty of that and the fragility of our mortality and the sense of our mortality going together, and how in modern society and how ideologies want to kind of abstract us from that and want to kind of give us scripts to say none of that matters. And I think, and I'm very reflective, we have this very strange form of hydrological phenomenon in North Carolina called freezing rain. Do you have that? I don't know if you have that in New York State. It's bizarre. We certainly don't have it in England. And everything shuts down, and always the power goes off where I live for a few days. And you realise that whatever my neighbours are all very different political complexions, and we have a gas oven in our house for some reason, and everyone else is electric. So we kind of make the hot meals. And the sense in which when freezing rain comes, we discover that the actual shared life we have in our midst of our fragility and mortality, divorced from the news feed scripts which are telling us we have no common life. And I think that's how to cut through the news scripts, the kind of news feeds, how to cut through the billions spent to tell us to believe particular ideological scripts which aren't actually true to the lives we actually live in communities with others, whether it's in schools or cul-de-sacs or whatever. I think that is a real challenge, and that kind of grounding in the lived, in the actual experiences and the beauties of spending time together, I think that is a precious gift that Christian humanism at its best has kind of tried to recover as a way of cutting through the clamour of this ideological polarisation. And I think that's something, a challenge for all of us, really.
So, two things, actually. First was when, Susannah, you mentioned the metaverse, I immediately thought, wow, I've never been so glad to be fumbling a microphone in a common space before. Once you mentioned that, it's like, I now know where I do not want to go. But second, I think, Luke, also what you said about being the one with the gas stove who could provide the hot meals in freezing rain is a metaphor, perhaps, for...
You're kidding.
Perhaps, for what Christian humanism has to offer in moments like these. When the freezing rain falls, when the crisis befalls us, this is when we really realize that, this truth that you described, Susannah, this thing that if it's real, everything is changed, is something that we as Christians have to offer to the world. Perhaps the most valuable thing one can offer to the world, and one that becomes both more needed and more visible, when the lights elsewhere have dimmed. And I think that feeling is actually one of the things that I got just reading through Breaking Ground and reading through sort of the development of thought over the course of this year that you cover, that there is still a light there, and that this is a moment in which we can present that and share that to others where it is extremely helpful and may actually be received.
Thank you all very much. I think that sense of crystallized light was a huge grace to us in producing this book and that sort of came around the book. And we just invite you to follow us. Breaking Ground is not going away. Right now, as I said, it's going to sort of hibernate a little bit into this sort of institutional ecosystem that is growing. And if you would like to talk to me, we would welcome different forms of collaboration, but the hope is to play a subtle yet really strong humanizing role in our society over the next 5, 10, 20 plus years that will have manifestations in the arts and in educational formation and in media and in the academy, and ultimately is sort of bound together by friends and strangers becoming friends and those sort of iterative encounters over and over and over. So thank you so much for joining this session, and thank you, Christine. And thank you,